In this video, I want to show you a rather unexpected city where I ended up this time, Ankara. Well, honestly, I understand that in general, Ankara does not sound cool or sexy at all. And I myself have also thought that Ankara is such a provincial city which by the will of fate has become the capital in which there's actually nothing to see. But suddenly, it turned out that Ankara also has something to surprise with. And at the same time, it is completely different from, for example, Istanbul. Ankara has its own history, a completely different atmosphere, and its own special flavor. And all this, gathered and mixed together over many years, turned out to be quite unusual and I may even say fascinating. The city actually turned out to be hardly much younger than its eternal antagonist Byzantium, the one that would later be called Constantinople and Istanbul. Then, however, Ankara was called a little differently, and I'm sure that many people know about it precisely because of the old name, Angora. That is, yes, Angora wool and Angora cats are all from here. Since its founding around the 6th century BC, Ankara, of course, managed to be part of all the states that existed on the territory of Asia Minor. From Lycia, Persia and Macedonia to Rome, you can't avoid it, can you? And then, of course, the fragments of the Roman Empire, the Latin Empire and the Byzantium. And then, of course, the Ottomans. But the most interesting for Ankara began a little later. In the 20s of the 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire was already collapsing, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, unable to use Constantinople occupied by the Entente countries, began to use Ankara as a decision-making center. And then, in 1923, he made it the city which has never been the main one, the capital of the Turkish Republic. From each of these historical periods, there are some artifacts remaining. I thought long and hard in what order I should show them and decided that probably I should not line them up chronologically, but it would be easier to show them in the order in which they appear during the walk. It is unlikely that the chronology is so important, and this way it's much easier to navigate through them. Oh, and I need some help from you here. Every time I wonder what's the best way to do it. Is it worth drawing a map or maybe leaving some geo tags? So I will leave a link to the poll in the description and in the comments, and I will really appreciate it if you participate and let me know what's the best way to do it. Here I finally start with one of the dominants of Ankara, the Hisar fortress above the city. As it often happens, this is the oldest part of Ankara, which at the time of its inception was a fortified city protected by walls. Now this fortress has somehow been divided into two unequal parts. The smaller part is the Tower of Ak-Kale, the so-called White Castle, which stands somewhat apart and generally speaking is not anything special. You can only walk up to it in order to look at it in the absence of people who are much more numerous in the main part of the fortress. But the tower itself seemed to me somewhat unkept. Well, to be honest, pretty abandoned, despite the flag on it. But on the way to and from it, there are rather unusual for modern Ankara old town buildings, which are now being actively restored in some places. But some parts of it still look like they did hundreds of years ago, when according to a legend, anyone who could build a house overnight could become a city resident. Of course, such huts missed the quality and the look, but at least they served their function. The main part of the fortress, much larger than the lone tower of Ak-Kale, is almost a full-fledged fortress, with gates and narrow passages inside. It is frustrating though that there are no signs, no stands, no descriptions of what you see. You can flounder there as you like, but only guessing what you see around. But at the same time, the admission is free. I think it must have something to do with it. The most spectacular part of the fortress is the bastion on the very top of the hill. You will have to climb another set of stairs to get there, but for those who love views from above, the panorama that opens from there is probably worth it. According to some information that I managed to find, this is the prison tower. So perhaps the notorious Zindan, which gave the name to the neighboring gate, was somewhere around here. If you know which way to look, then from the top of the tower you can also see the final point of today's walk, the Anitkabir Memorial Complex. I personally think it would be particularly spectacular to climb the fortress walls at sunset or dawn. But the fortress itself only opens around 10 AM, so the only option available is sunset. For obvious reasons, this is the most popular time. There is no information around, so it is sometimes quite difficult to understand what is what. But on the other hand, the freedom is almost absolute as well. There are no guards or no employees around. In some places, there are some flimsy fences that are not able to stop anyone anyway. And as a result, you can climb anywhere, so pretty soon you're no longer surprised by the sight of Humpty Dumptys on the ancient walls. Basically, everyone walks along the top of the walls, not at all interested in what's under their feet. But a little lower, you can actually get inside the wall into one of the interior rooms with loopholes around the perimeter. And I think lovers of the off-beaten tracks will understand my excitement when I found it. You can still admire the views on the descent if you're lucky to not have a lot of people around. And then you can enter the fortress through one of the two main gates, the Zindan gate. I don't know exactly where the dungeon that gave them their name was. There still are no signs at all. There's a restaurant behind the gate to the right, and for the lovers of some simpler food, sweets are sometimes sold between the portals, clearly preventing the workers from going where they need. Inside the fortress, there is a usual noisy Turkish bazaar, and of course the complete absence of all sorts of pointers. But I seem to have already complained about this. Only knowing what to look for and where to look, you can find a quiet corner a little away from the seething main street with Roman artifacts built into the wall during its repair. No respect for antiquity at all. However, when this was done, Rome was not yet so far away. So they dismantled what could have become a historical monument simply to patch a hole in the wall. And further, the narrow streets again explode with a noise and din of cafes and shops with all the regular tourist rubbish. The second exit and the second main gate of the fortress is the so-called clock gate. Next to them, there is a conspicuous clock tower, and outside a rather large area or a square where you can come by taxi if you wish. Perhaps this makes sense because, as I said, the fortress itself stands on a hill, and I must say quite a steep hill. Therefore, if you're not a fan of climbing, you can come by car like a royal. But then at least try to go down. The streets leading to the fortress are filled with little shops, and this is a separate cultural ecstasy. They have everything from spices to rake, and from restaurants to hairdressers. And if you're lucky, you can even find a lamp with a little genie. Oh, come on, this is Persia. There's just one question left. Who needs pitchforks and cowbells here? Tourists? Really? The next point, there are actually two of them, is the fragment of the Roman history of Ankara. For starters, the Temple of Augustus, or rather a couple of walls left from it. It looks quite picturesque given the turbulent history of the temple built back in the 4th century AD. Under the Christians it was a church, under the Ottomans a madrasa, and then a grain storage. And mind you, no one's offended. If necessary, well, let the church be a warehouse. It's the Dutch that treat churches with a similar graceful utility. In one, for example, they made an excellent beer bar. Returning to the Temple of Augustus, it was also badly damaged by bombs during the war in 1944 and restored only in 1947. The second legacy of the Roman Empire in Ankara is a kind of a monument to Emperor Julian. A 15-meter column with ring-shaped decorations stands not far from the Temple of Augustus. It's easy to walk to it, and it was built around the same time in honor of the arrival of the Emperor Julian to the city. The emperor is famous for trying to revive paganism, for which he received his nickname, apostate. But the column in honor of his arrival was nevertheless built a year before his death, and now it's the storks happily nesting on the top, reminding of Ak-Kale Daenerys. I will probably stop here with an ancient history of Ankara. There is also an interesting museum of Anatolian civilizations, but I didn't have enough time for it, and as usual I was more interested to see the city, not the museum. The modern history of Ankara is completely unthinkable without mentioning Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who in general made the capital out of a provincial city. The reasons for choosing Ankara are beyond the scope of this video, but it was Ataturk who gave impetus to the development of a city, with then the population of less than 100,000 people. And not only by the construction of buildings. According to legend, it was by his decree that the youth park, Genclik, was built, although it was opened as much as 5 years after the death of Ataturk. Compared to classic French or English parks, Gençlik does not cause much awe, although given the dry and hot Turkey, it's still quite impressive. Its main attraction is a huge lake with the fountains, which the Turks generally like to install not only in this, but also in other parks throughout Ankara. Not far from the Julian column is probably the most famous monument to Ataturk on Ulus Square. Despite the apparent significance, the square itself is rather uncomfortable. Noisy, dirty, and in general everything looks like a monument was placed between the market and the bus station. Ataturk himself on a horse stands on the top on a pedestal, which is framed below by 3 figures, which for me personally evoke rather unpleasant associations with the woman's inequality. 2 of the 3 figures are soldiers. One is looking intently for something ahead, dignified, confident, purposeful. The second soldier, no less heroic, calls to follow him, and again we see inspiration, masculinity, and all other attractive attributes. While the third figure is a woman, not only does it stand behind the monument, but it also carries a heavy projectile. And frankly, she doesn't look enthusiastic or happy at all. Sure, all works are good and important, but these are my feelings, and it was very unpleasant for me. In part, this unpleasant feeling was leveled by the monument near the Ataturk Mausoleum, which is the second dominant of Ankara, and of course worth visiting, even if you're not a fan of Turkish history. I was lucky, and I was in Ankara on the eve of Turkey's Independence Day. Therefore, on the one hand, everything was additionally decorated, but on the other hand, there was quite a lot of people. But in any case, to be honest, I somehow lost the habit of seeing the streets blocked by trucks. I did not have much choice anyway, but I was once again happy that I mostly traveled by foot. The mausoleum is only part of the huge Anitkabir memorial complex located on one of the hills of Ankara. At the time of construction, this hill was in the very center of Ankara, and the mausoleum should have been visible from anywhere in the city. To the credit of the Turks, when preparing the site for construction, they carried out archaeological excavations on the hill, and all the artifacts they found, mostly Hittite, were carefully transferred to the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations. As expected, there is a checkpoint in front of the entrance, where very attentive guys check all the incoming people, and if you pay attention, the same guys will often flicker on the videos inside. And yes, it's important to say that the entrance to the complex itself and to all its museums is completely free. The first place you get to after the checkpoint is the so-called Peace Park, planted around the main object, the mausoleum itself, where Ataturk was reburied in 1953. The whole complex, in a completely neoclassical style, began to be built 6 years after his death and was under construction for quite a long time, as many as 9 years, from 1944 to 1953, year in which the project managed to become somewhat simplified. Not drastically, of course. It's still a rectangular building on one side of a large ceremonial square, on the 3 other sides bounded by a wall with a colonnade, under which there are several museum expositions. The small exposition, the entrance to which is located at the bottom of the stairs leading to the square, is dedicated to the activities of Ataturk as the head of the country. There are mostly photographs of him with various world leaders of the time and from numerous trips around the country. To be honest, for a person from the outside of the Turkey, it's not too exciting. And I must say there are not many Turks there as well. The second and the largest exposition is located under the entire square, and in order to get there you may have to stand in line for quite a while under the colonnade on the right if you look at the mausoleum from the square. The beginning of it reminded me very much of Lenin's mausoleum on Red Square in Moscow. You can't take pictures, you don't have to stop, the guards are on every corner. Very strange atmosphere, and it's not very clear why. This is not even a Lenin's mummy, but simply an exposition of Ataturk's personal belongings. The following parts are devoted to the formation of the Turkish Republic, the fight against intervention and the Sultan's rule, and in general about the Ataturk's rise to power. Basically, these are paintings, wax figures and portraits of comrades in arms. You are allowed to take pictures here, but after the previous rooms, you don't really feel like it. I personally found the third exposition, which is located in the corner turrets, to be the most interesting for me. It is small and shows, for example, personal cars used by Ataturk. Cadillacs, by the way. Some of the exhibits looked quite surprising. For example, they keep the old flagpole of the complex. There it is, laying horizontally in the background. I still don't quite understand its value. At the colonnade at the opposite end of the square from the mausoleum, there is a grave of the second Prime Minister of Turkey, Ismet Inonu, who replaced Ataturk. But the scale, well, you can see for yourself. On the other hand, it's the only place in the whole memorial that offers a view of Ankara laying below. I can't say it's breathtaking, but whatever. You know, I'm not a big fan of panoramas from a bird's height. A separate attraction of the complex are the guards of honor. As far as I understand, they represent different types of troops, so they have 3 different types of uniforms. Their way of marching is quite specific, and most importantly, it is not clear who gives the commands. It seems that it's not the relief commander, but who else can do it? Everywhere except for the grave of Ataturk, they are armed, and everywhere they're looked after and helped by the guys I mentioned before. The work, of course, is not easy, but there are some tips and tricks, like a special finger loops on the belts. And one more thing. It is the way they wear helmets according to the statute. It looks quite, let me say, strange, doesn't it? But whatever, these are not my rules. The mausoleum itself is a separate attraction. You can't film there with the professional equipment, there are guards everywhere, well, at least here it's clear why, but at least unlike the mausoleum on Red Square in Moscow, there is no oppressive feeling. This one is quite bright and I would say quite spacious. At the sarcophagus, over the grave of Ataturk, there is a guard of honor, mind you without weapon, and security. And for visitors, this is both a place for respect and at the same time quite a reason to take a selfie. I will refrain here from discussing the personality of Ataturk. This is far beyond the scope of this video, and like any major statesman, he is of course a large-scale figure and of course quite ambiguous. So I will leave these assessments to the Turks themselves. We should somehow finally sort things out with our own rulers. The last part of the memorial complex is the so-called Lion Road. It is so named because of the stone figures of lions along it. The road itself is paved with stones with quite a huge gap between them. According to legend, this was done so that people walking along this road would not be in a hurry and could think about something serious. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but walking on it is really not very convenient, especially for girls on heels. But they need to walk everywhere with caution anyway, don't they? At the very end of the Road of Lions there are 2 small pavilions, inside which there are several more items related to Ataturk. There is, for example, his motorboat, as well as a gun carriage which served as a hearse during the funeral. Between the pavilions there are 2 symmetrical monuments to Turkish men and women, this time without any distortion. As a result, it turned out that Ankara, despite some of its provinciality, if I may say so about the capital of the state, turned out to be not at all the most boring place. Probably it will still be more interesting for people who are interested in the history of Turkey and who know more about it. But even for me, a person from the outside, there was quite something to see in Ankara. Whether to go there on purpose or not is totally up to you as usual. I would like to believe that I managed to give you some general idea about the city and what's interesting there, for you to decide yourself. At the time, I thought that this video would be the hardest to make it exciting for you. But I was wrong. The next video from Birmingham raised many more questions and turned out to be a lot more difficult. But even there is something to see and to show you. So thank you, warm Ankara. The next city will be in Albion. See you there!